Section 100 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 100. Samuel H. Rodabaugh. I was born near Lancaster, Fairfield County, Ohio, September 29, 1842. With my parents moved to Hancock County, Ohio, the 5th of June, 1848. I became a Christian by the mercy of God in August, 1853, and united with the Church of the United Brethren in Christ in December, 1853. I want to say, to the praise of God, that He has helped me so to live that the Church has not been necessitated to remove my name from its records from that day until now. I enlisted in Company K of the 65th Regiment Ohio Infantry, September 5, 1862. The regiment was a part of the renowned Sherman's Brigade. Its first colonel was that brilliant young officer, General Harker. He never commanded the regiment much, but commanded the brigade until he was made brigadier general, and then he commanded a division much of the time until his death at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, Georgia. I was married the 2nd of October, 1862. Was detained in Ohio, one place and another, until sometime in December, 1862, when about 30 of us recruits, in charge of Colonel Castle, joined our command in a camp near Nashville, Tennessee. Here, for 12 or 15 days, we recruits had the pleasure of all the division, brigade, regiment, company, and also that famous, wonderful, and enjoyable squad drill. All those days of drill came in good play in the near future, for from the 30th of December, 1862, to January 2, 1863, we played a conspicuous part in the Battle of Stone River, Tennessee. Here, along with 10 of my company, I was taken prisoner, but I played dead and got away from the Johnnies, while the other 9 comrades went on a journey to Libby. I was in 16 of the hard battles of the war, and in the summer of 1864 on the Atlanta campaign I was under fire more or less almost daily from the 8th of May at Rocky Face Ridge to the 2nd of September at Atlanta, Georgia. On the 30th of November, 1864, at the memorable Battle of Franklin, Tennessee, I was again taken prisoner and this time took a trip to Andersonville, that indescribable den of suffering, sorrow, and death. I want to say of Andersonville prison that human tongue has never told, nor pen ever written, and never will tell or write the horrors, suffering, and cruelty inflicted on the prisoners at Andersonville by Weirs and his guards, and I firmly believe that they but executed the will of Jeff Davis and his allies. I will give some death rates that I gathered from official records as follows. Of 12,400 persons taken to the hospital, 76% died. In May, 1864, of 18,454 prisoners, 701 died, 23 per day. In June, 1864, of 26,364 prisoners, 1,202 died, 40 per day. In July, 1864, of 31,678 prisoners, 1,742 died, 56 per day. In August, 1864, of 31,693 prisoners, 3,076 died, 99 per day. On the 23rd of August, 1864, was the greatest mortality, 127 died, 1 for every 11 minutes. You will allow me to say that I call that treatment wholesale murder, and of the most cruel kind known to history. As stated above, I was taken prisoner on the 30th of November, 1864, and hence was in Andersonville during the winter of 1864 and 1865. I, with 11 others, bought out of Andersonville in March, 1865, and arrived in God's country at Big Black River on the 31st of March, 1865. While here along with thousands of paroled prisoners, Lee and Johnson surrendered, and President Lincoln was assassinated. All of us thought that the wicked slaveholders' rebellion was about bursted up. On the evening of the 25th of April, 1865, at Vicksburg, Mississippi, about 2,300 of us, nearly all paroled prisoners from Andersonville and Cahaba dens, were crowded on board the steamer Sultana. She arrived at Memphis, Tennessee, on the evening of the 26th of April, 1865, with her load of human beings and about 100 tons of sugar. She remained there until the sugar was unloaded. I helped unload the sugar and received 75 cents an hour for the time I worked. At about 10 o'clock p.m. on the 26th of April, she went to a coal barge and took on a supply of coal. About midnight I asked one of the deckhands, "How soon do you expect to start up the river?" and he replied, "At 1 o'clock." That would be the morning of the 27th. Now remember, kind reader, we were on our way home from the cruel war, it being virtually over. We were on our way home from those horrid dens of cruelty and starvation. Yes, we had lived through it all, and hoped, yes, expected soon, to see loved ones, and home, and enjoy at least some of the peace we had fought to restore. Home! Yes, home under the stars and stripes once more. While thus pleasantly meditating, all of a sudden, about 1:30 a.m., one of the boilers exploded, and the greater part of that human load was blown into the river while sound asleep, some to awake in the cold water and some in eternity. Those that were not blown off at the time of the explosion were soon compelled to jump into the river so as to escape burning to death, for the boat quickly caught fire and burned to the water's edge. About 1,750 of that homeward bound company perished then and there, and several hundred more poor fellows died in the next 10 days from wounds, burns, and scalds. I say, fearless of truthful contradiction, that the explosion of the Sultana was the greatest calamity of the war against the slave-holding rebels, and it was the greatest steamboat disaster known to history. You will naturally ask 2 questions. First, how did you escape? And second, how did the calamity occur? To the latter question I can but give you my opinion, and that has never changed since I got ashore and took time to think. I believe that some enemy of our Union had a hand in crowding so many of us on the boat, and that he knew when that Southern sugar was taken off that the rest of the cargo and the boat would meet the fate that followed. I believe that some ally of Jeff Davis put a torpedo in the coal while we were at Memphis, where it would go into the furnace for the first fire that would be built after leaving Memphis, with the intent to destroy the boat and its mass of human heroes on their way home. I can say that in May, 1888, a man in the South, William C. Streeter, St. Louis, Missouri, said that he knew the man, Charles Dale, who said he chiseled a hole in a large chunk of coal, put a torpedo therein, which did the deadly work, carried it with his own hands, and laid it where it must soon go into the furnace. I will say one thing more, and that is, if I were in authority, I would arrest and hang the man who knew so high-handed and bloody a murderer and did not try to have him brought to justice for so gigantic a crime. Now as to my escape. I was lying by the side of the ice box under the same blanket with J. B. Horner, of Company K of the 65th Ohio, and J. W. Vanscoyce, of Company A of the 64th Ohio, sound asleep when the explosion took place. I was blown off the boat into the water, and was under the water when I awoke. When I came to the surface, I tried for a moment to get on the ice box, for it was in the water as well as myself. but so many were trying to get onto it that it would do none of us any good, so I swam away to a spot in the river where there were no human beings, and there concluded that the boat had sank, and knew no better until I saw the boat on fire. I soon got on a large rail and remained on it for some time. I lost consciousness, and when I came to know again I had lost my rail. Then, as soon as I could, I got a piece of the banister of the wrecked boat, both rails together about 4 feet long, and on this little raft I remained and suffered with the cold and cramps until daylight, when I was picked up by a few boatmen on the gunboat Essex, about 2 miles below Memphis, having floated with the current about 10 miles, and had been in the water from about 1:30 in the morning until daylight on the 27th of April. I was taken to the Gayoso Hospital at Memphis and treated for injuries in my breast and groin. I am and have for the last 20 years been a regular minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ in the church of my early choice. I want all of the readers to remember that it costs something to preserve this government's interest. I want to ask you to kindly remember the old soldiers, and especially the surviving prisoners of the late war against the most wanton rebellion and in support of the best government on earth. I wish hereby to thank God for preserving my life and permitting me to enjoy so much of the peace I suffered to hand down to future generations. Residence and Post Office address, Lindsay, Ohio. End of section 100. Section 101 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 101. Christian Ray. I was born near Centerville, Indiana, January 1, 1829. Enlisted at New Westville, Preble County, on or about the 20th of August, 1862, in Company C, 50th Regiment Ohio Volunteer Infantry. Was captured at Franklin, Tennessee, November 30, 1864, and was confined in the Cahaba Prison, Alabama. Was put on board the Sultana and started for Columbus to be discharged. When we arrived at Memphis, they were unloading sugar and hogs. I think that a rebel fixed a torpedo in the coal. After leaving Memphis, having gone about 7 miles above, the torpedo was shoveled into the fire, which caused the explosion between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning. It blew the pilot house and everything off within 3 feet of where my partner and I lay. The rubbish fell down on us and pinned us there for a while. Finally we worked ourselves out and slid down the stayrod. The steam was so dense that we could not see our way, but we got down on the lower deck amidst the crowd. Some were praying and some cursing. All kinds of talk was going on. As we passed along we came across a stage plank about 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 2 inches thick. My partner knew I could not swim. We then carried the plank to the edge of the boat and threw it off. My partner said to me, "This is all I can do for you, jump on it." I never exchanged a word, but jumped on the plank, struck one edge of the board and it turned over with me 2 or 3 times. Finally I got my breast fixed on one end of it and held on with one hand and worked away with the other. The current being strong, I was carried away before the main body commenced jumping out. Good swimmers were fighting and kicking to keep off those unfortunates who could not swim, but all in vain. They clustered together and went down. When I saw this I worked harder to get away. In a short time I was out of sight, so that was good-bye to the burning Sultana. I then looked up and thought I saw a boat coming, so I turned my board up the stream and worked hard for a little while, but found it was useless. I was going downstream all the time, so I turned my board and let it float. I floated back to Memphis and lodged on a pile of driftwood. There were 5 other men screaming for life. After a while some good Samaritan ran in with a skiff and took us out. I was nearly chilled to death and was carried up to the barracks. Here I was placed in front of a roaring hot fire and given enough alcohol to kill 3 men in a common condition before they could get a reaction to take place. I was taken to the hospital that night, which was the 27th of April. The next morning we started for Columbus, where I was discharged and sent home. I have not done anything for 7 years. I am totally disabled and crippled up, and have rheumatism, heart disease, and dropsy. Present post office address, Greenville, Ohio. End of section 101. Section 102 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 102. George F. Robinson. I was born in Girard, Erie County, Pennsylvania, in the year 1845, and enlisted at Charlotte, Michigan, August 1, 1861, in Company I, 6th Regiment Michigan Volunteer Infantry. Re-enlisted August 2, 1863. Enlisted again August 3, 1864, in Company C, 2nd Regiment Michigan Cavalry. I was taken prisoner November 5, 1864, at Shoal Creek, Alabama, by rebel General Hood. Was taken across the river and the first night camped at Tuscumbia. The next morning we started for Corinth, arriving there in the evening about 8 o'clock. The next morning following we were put on the train and taken to Meridian, Mississippi, reaching there at 5 o'clock p.m. The first thing that greeted my ears on arriving at the prison was fresh fish. I had a few rations and was told to look out or someone would steal them. I was much surprised to think that they would try to steal rations from a soldier who had put over 3 years in the service, so I took 2 pieces of rail and laid them down, took my hat, put my haversack in it, and put them both between the rails, and I then laid down on all and said to myself, "You will fool an old soldier, will you?" I slept good all night, and on awaking in the morning reached for my rations, but found none. Someone had dug a hole under the rails and stolen them. I tell you I was the most beat man you ever saw. Experience number 1 as a prisoner. About the 20th of November a party of 8 of us commenced digging a tunnel. It was slow work, for we had to look out for the guards, and they kept very close watch, but we succeeded at last. 6 of us got out, but when about 60 miles away were captured by an old woman and 15 dogs and brought back to Meridian, the worst looking lot of men you ever saw. We were covered with clay from head to foot by going through the tunnel, which was half full of water at the time of our escape. Everything went along quietly for about a month, and then we started for Cahaba, Alabama, the prison known as Castle Morgan. At this time my clothing consisted of shirt, drawers, and 1 shoe. About 6 miles from Demopolis, John Corliss and myself made our escape by jumping out of the car window. I did not stop immediately, but rolled along after the train quite a distance. I tell you I was badly mangled and had a big hole cut in my head, but I thought it was all right, for I was free once more. That is, I was in my mind, for it was not but a short time before I heard the dogs and we had to go, but we kept away from them for 5 days and 5 nights when we were recaptured. We were almost starved and nearly frozen. Had nothing to eat but raw corn and no fire, and wallowing through the swamp in the month of December. If it was down south, the weather was awful cold, for it would freeze icicles on the trees from 3 to 4 inches in length. We were taken back to Meridian and then transferred to Cahaba. When we got there it was the same old story, fresh fish. I was in prison about 1 month, and then succeeded in getting out again by cutting a hole through the wall next to the river. John Corliss and myself got out, but were caught before we had hardly got a start. We were north of Selma when recaptured and were put in a large hall about 18 feet from the ground. We managed to get a hole through the brick wall, doing our work with an old knife and a piece of round iron, I think a piece of a poker. We got out all right, but did not get out of the city, and were recaptured and taken back to Cahaba. In March 1865 the water from the river flooded the prison to the depth of 3 or 4 feet, in consequence of which we were ordered for exchange. The next move was to place us on a stern-wheel steamer with 4 large cannons on the bow, but before we reached our destination the boys had all the 4 guns spiked with old files they found on the boat. At last we arrived at camp, 4 miles from Vicksburg, and were there when President Lincoln was assassinated. In a day or 2 after this we were taken to Vicksburg and put on board the steamboat Sultana. Everything went smoothly until we reached Memphis, Tennessee, where they unloaded a large quantity of sugar that was in the hold of the boat. I, for one, helped. Now, if my memory serves me right, there were about 2,300 people on board the Sultana. We left Memphis in the evening, went across the river to a coaling station, and took on a large quantity of coal. I was asleep when we left and was lying on the promenade deck between the smokestacks. I did not hear the explosion. I think I was stunned, for the first I recollected I heard someone calling, "For God's sake, cut the deck, I am burning to death." Then I tried to find out where I was, and when I did, I found I was in the coal in front of the arches. The deck I had laid on was on top of me. My arms were scalded, and the hot steam was so thick I could hardly breathe, and in fact I gave up. My partner, John Corliss, was lying across my legs and was dead, killed by the deck falling on him. I then heard someone say, "Jack, you can get out this way." It was some comrade helping his bunkmate out. This is the last I can recollect until someone put his hand on my shoulder and said, "What will I do? I cannot swim." I looked around and, my God, what a sight! There were 300 or 400, all in a solid mass, in the water and all trying to get on top. I guess that nearly all were drowned, but that was not the worst sight. The most horrid of all was to see the men fast in the wreck and burning to death. Such screaming and yelling I never heard before or since. It makes me shiver to think of it. At this time I was sitting on the bow of the boat, with my arm around the flagstaff, facing the Tennessee shore. At length the flames burned it down and I was forced to take to the water. I turned around and got in the water on the Arkansas side. There were some amusing things transpired. For instance, one man was on a beer keg, and he would crawl up on it and pray. He got up a little too far, and over he went, still hanging to it. He came up on the other side of it, and the first thing I heard him say was, "Damn this thing, it will drown me yet." I drifted away from him, and could hear some poor soul say, "My God, I cannot hold out any longer," and down he would go. All this time I kept up good courage, and was sure I could get out all right. I got close to the islands but could not make the trees. The islands were all overflowed and some of the boys got in the treetops. I could hear someone calling, "Morgan, here is your mule." It was a mule that saved my life and a dead one at that. I was almost a goner when I saw a dark object in the water and made for it, and it was a dead mule, one that was blown off the boat. He was dead but not quite cold. I crawled up on him and was there when I was picked up at Fort Pickens, 3 miles below Memphis. I was unconscious at the time, being chilled through, having been in the water about 4 hours. I was put in an ambulance and taken to Memphis to a hotel and remained there for 6 or 7 days. Was then sent to Camp Chase, Columbus, Ohio, and from there to Jackson, Michigan. From Jackson to Charlotte, my home. 3 months after I was weighed and my weight was 109 pounds. My present occupation is shoe clerk and my post office address 720 Corunna Ave, Owasso, Michigan. End of section 102. Section 103 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 103. Peter Rosello. I was born in France, October 28, 1849, and enlisted in the service of the United States, October 6, 1862, at Maurytown, Highland County, Ohio, in Company E, 50th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, and took to the field almost as soon as we reached Camp Dennison, Ohio, and participated in all the marches and battles of the regiment, including Perryville and the Atlanta campaign. At Atlanta was sent back to take care of Hood, and fell back until we reached Franklin, Tennessee. There I was captured on that bloody battlefield, November 30, 1864, and taken in the front line, together with 7 others of my company and 62 of the regiment. I was then taken back to Columbia, Tennessee, and guarded in the stone fort, where I almost froze to death. We 8 had to lie under one blanket, having lost all we had in the fight. It was very cold. About the time that the rebels got whipped at Nashville, they made us get out of the old stone fort in a hurry and marched us through mud, water, and rain to the Tennessee River, where they ferried us across in pontoon boats, then put us on the cars, and we went to Corinth and then to Meridian, Mississippi. They kept us there until after New Year's, and then we went to Selma, Alabama, where they put us in prison overnight and gave us hardtack for rations, the last we had until we reached our lines a few months later. The following morning we marched to Cahaba, Alabama, where they searched every one of us and turned us into the prison. There we stayed 2 days before we received any rations, and when we did get them there was not much, being a pint of cornmeal and a taste of meat. About this time I had to go out on the skirmish line every day, so as to keep our little friends from getting too numerous, else they would have carried us away. I refer to the faithful "grayback." So it went on until the mutiny, but I had no hand in that. Had to do without rations for 3 days and pass inspection entirely naked before the rebels on account of it. Then all was well till the prison overflowed. I think it was on March 1st when we had to hunt a dry place to lie down in. I succeeded the first and second night, but after that none was to be found. The rebels now took pity on us by taking us downtown to get cordwood and fix up a scaffold out of the water. That evening we were taken out again, put on board a steamboat, carried down the river some miles, loaded a boat full of cordwood, got extra rations, then returned to Cahaba and unloaded part of the wood. We then made ready to go back in the prison, but the order was countermanded. We slept on the boat that night and got some more extra rations. They tasted good on that dry boat. The morning followed we started for Selma, Alabama. They put us in a dry prison, and the next week we were under parole of honor, and when everything was in readiness marched us out of prison on board a train of cars and started us for Meridian and Jackson, Mississippi. From here we marched on foot to Big Black River, where we beheld the glorious Stars and Stripes once again. We cheered and shouted until hoarse. Then we had a square meal of Uncle Sam's gruel, and then marched across the bridge and bid farewell to rebeldom forever. We were then marched within about 5 miles of Vicksburg, Mississippi, where we bunked in the parole camp. This was on March 19, 1865. We were kept in parole camp till about April 25th, on which date we were taken aboard the ill-fated Sultana, and on the second night after embarking we arrived at Memphis, Tennessee. After unloading a cargo of sugar we took on coal, then started, and when about 8 miles up the river the disaster took place. I was lying with 2 comrades on the cabin floor forward, between the stairway and the fore part of the boat. Was sound asleep, but was suddenly awakened by the explosion. After I had recovered from the first shock, I climbed down on the lower deck, by means of ropes and spikes, to the front part of the boat, for the stairway was blockaded, and the upper deck or floor had fallen on it. Imagine, if you can, the scene that followed. No pen or tongue can portray it. Imagine yourself in the midst of about 2,000 souls, all crowded on a steamboat torn to pieces by the explosion of her boiler in the dead of the night. If I remember right, all the after part of the deck was blown overboard, and the forward part of the deck fell in. How many were killed, I cannot tell. Then in a few minutes the fire broke out, and the boat was all ablaze. I saw many men mangled, some with arms and legs broken, others scalded and screaming in their agony, while others would be fighting over a piece of timber or plank, and some crying or praying, some jumping in the water to escape from the fire and drowning. It was a scene I never care to witness again. There were 7 of our company on the boat, and 5 of them perished. If it had not been for the grace of God we too would have perished. After I had got down on the lower deck I waited for a favorable opportunity to save myself. After a large number of the men had made their escape or were drowned, I watched for a clear space in the river, for I was afraid some one would catch hold of me and I would share the fate of the others. I jumped off into the river and swam away as fast as I could for a short distance. Then I took it slow, for I had a mile or 2 to go. I got hold of some pieces of plank tied together with a pair of suspenders, doubtless the work of some poor fellow who had perished. I put them under my left arm and steered with my right, until I reached the timber where I expected to find dry land, but was disappointed, for the water was so deep that we could not touch the bottom with rails and poles. I say we, because there were others within speaking distance of me. So we had to climb a sapling tree and roost there. I was almost chilled to death. If I had not held on to the sapling with one hand and rubbed myself briskly with the other I could not have survived. After some time, however, I got warmed up and did the best I could to keep the mosquitoes from eating me up. When the sun came up it warmed me and I waited patiently for help, which did not come till about 10 o'clock that morning. When the first steamboat made its appearance it cheered up the poor boys and we shouted, but it stopped way below us. So did the second, third, and fourth, but the 5th one, the little picket boat, came boldly up to where we were and sent out its boats and picked us all up. We then started for Memphis, where I was taken to the Soldiers' Home. Others were taken to private dwellings, and some to the hospital, where I was taken later. As luck would have it, here I met my comrade, the only other one of the 7. The others were all lost. This was about April 27, 1865. In a day or 2 we got some new clothing and blankets, and then were taken aboard the Belle of St. Louis and steamed up to Cairo, Illinois, where we landed the next day late in the afternoon. I could not repress a shout of joy when I again set my foot on land, for I was afraid of boats and water. From there I went to Camp Chase, Ohio, and was discharged on May 20, 1865. Occupation, farming. Post office address, Mowrystown, Ohio. End of section 103. Section 104 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 104. Robert Rule. I enlisted in the service of the United States as a private at Nashville, Tennessee, June 10, 1863, in Company A, 3rd Regiment Tennessee Cavalry, and was captured at Sulphur Trestle, Alabama, in September 1864 and confined in the Cahaba prison. At the time of the explosion I, with several others, was on top of the boat, and we climbed down by a rope to the deck. One of my company and myself threw a trough in the river and jumped in. I did not catch hold of the trough, but got onto a plank with 6 others. We floated down the river 2 miles and came to some bushes. We all grabbed onto them, but one of my comrades lost his hold of the plank and was drowned. The next morning we were picked up by a boat and taken to Memphis. Occupation, farming. Post office address, Rockford, Blount County, Tennessee. End of section 104. Section 105 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 105. O. C. Russell. I enlisted at Somerset, Kentucky, June 1863, as a private in Company C, 3rd Tennessee Cavalry, and was captured at Sulphur Branch Trestle, Alabama, I think in September 1864, and confined in the Cahaba prison. Was released about 1 month previous to the explosion. I took the boat at Vicksburg about the 26th of April. We stopped at Memphis and unloaded hogsheads of sugar. I was asleep when we left there, but was awakened when the explosion took place. A party of us threw a staging overboard, got upon it, and were rescued at Memphis and taken to a hospital. From there we went to Cairo, Illinois, then to Indianapolis, Indiana, and on to Columbus, Ohio. Was discharged from the service in June 1865. Occupation, farming. Post office, Morgantown, Tennessee. End of section 105. Section 106 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 106. S. F. Sanders. I was born in Farmington, Illinois, April 16, 1845, and enlisted in the service of the United States at Bushnell, Illinois, May 12, 1864, in Company I, 137th Regiment Illinois Volunteers. Was captured at Memphis, Tennessee, August 21, 1864, and confined in the Cahaba, Alabama prison. The Western boys were sent to Springfield, Illinois, several days before the Sultana was loaded. I was nursing the sick in the barracks and did not leave Vicksburg until the last boatload, and so far as I have ever known, I was the only Illinois boy on the boat. I had charge of 16 sick comrades who were sleeping in front of the cabin. I had just laid down when the explosion took place. About daylight I was pushed off from the stern of the boat into the water. I climbed on the rudder and remained there for some time with 11 others until it got too hot for us. Fortunately for us we made our way to a platform on one side of the boat and were rescued by rebels on a raft. Occupation, physician. Post office address, Holdridge, Nebraska. End of section 106. Section 107 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 107. C. S. Schmutz. I was born in Congress, Ohio, on the 22nd of July, 1846. Enlisted in the service of the United States at Congress, Ohio, on the 2nd of August, 1862, in Company I, 102nd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. Was captured at Athens, Alabama, on the 24th of September, 1864, and confined in Cahaba until the 24th of March, 1865, when I was released and sent to Vicksburg, Mississippi. My experience in regard to the explosion of the ill-fated Sultana is as follows. In the afternoon of April 26, 1865, we arrived at the city of Memphis, Tennessee, where was unloaded a number of hogsheads of sugar, which I think was one of the causes of the explosion. There were about 2,300 persons on board. A great many of the soldiers were on the upper decks, and as the boat came round a bend of the river, it would careen, the water rushing to one side of the boilers, the others would become heated, and as the boat righted, the water would rush to the heated boilers, thus causing the explosion. Before leaving the wharf at Memphis I went asleep, but I remember being awakened by the boat coaling up some distance up the river. I soon went asleep again, and the next I knew I felt a burning and falling sensation, and remember calling, "What's the matter?" Being a good swimmer, I had no fear. My first impression was that I had been thrown into the river, and I tried to swim to the boat. I soon found many in the river like myself. That the boiler had exploded never entered my mind. Presently I saw flames, and knew then that the boat was on fire. In the meantime I came across some wreckage of the boat, among which was a piece of a cracker box. It was sufficient to support me. I also found out that I was scalded about the face, and every now and then plunged my face into the water to cool it off. I made no effort to swim ashore, as I knew the river had overflowed its banks, and I did not relish the idea of climbing a tree to get out of the water when I had nothing on but my shirt. That would be very unpleasant. I took my chance going down the river, as I knew we could not be far above Memphis. I had for companion a while a man who was moon-eyed and could not see at night. He was floating on a long board, and generously offered to share his board with me, but I had all the support I needed. After I had been in the water about 2 hours, I heard some one rowing a boat, and I called for help. The reply was, "Here's one." Then I saw the boatmen row towards me, and they pulled me in the boat. I now found I was badly scalded on my left side and back. After picking out of the river a few more of my unfortunate comrades, the boat rowed for the shore and we were landed and taken to a convalescent camp, where I continued to suffer the most excruciating pain. I ran up and down in the cool air to relieve the pain. I felt easy going against the wind, but returning it was excruciating. I was urged to lie down, but for a time refused. Finally I yielded after putting on a pair of cotton drawers and shirt. I lay down on a cot that had been prepared for me. Soon afterwards an ambulance came and took me to Gayoso Hospital, where I lay for 10 days, during which time I fully recovered, and getting transportation I was sent to Columbus, Ohio, where I was discharged from the service. My present occupation is clerk. Post office address, Wooster, Ohio. End of section 107. Section 108 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 108. C. G. Seabury. I was born in Verona, Oneida County, New York, in 1844, and enlisted at Quincy, Michigan, November 17, 1862, in Company B, 8th Michigan Cavalry. Was captured near Mount Pleasant, Tennessee, November 20, 1864, and confined in the Meridian, Mississippi, and Cahaba, Alabama prisons. Post Office, Coloma, Michigan. End of section 108. Section 109 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 109. W. R. Shawl. I was born in Clark County, Ohio, February 27, 1836, and enlisted in the service of the United States at Cable, Ohio, July 16, 1862, in Company E, 95th Regiment Ohio Volunteer Infantry. Was captured at Guntown, Mississippi, June 12, 1864, and confined in 5 prisons, namely, Andersonville, Millen, Savannah, Blackshear, and Thomasville. I swam from the burning wreck to the Tennessee shore, securing a window shutter to help me, got into the woods, caught hold of a limb of a bush, and held on until daylight. Then I swam to a log about 25 yards distant and got upon it. I was picked up by the steamer Silver Spray. Occupation, dealer in general merchandise. Address, Cable, Ohio. End of section 109. Section 110 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 110. I. N. Schaefer. Born in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, December 5, 1833, and enlisted in the service of the United States at Canton, Ohio, September 5, 1862, in Company E, 115th Ohio Volunteer Infantry. Was captured at Nashville, Tennessee, December 4, 1863, and confined in the Meridian, Andersonville, and Cahaba prisons. I floated down the river on a door to Memphis and was picked up by Negro troops. Occupation, tailor. Post office address, Canton, Ohio. End of section 110. Section 111 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 111. Peyton Shields. I enlisted in Company D, 31st Regiment Ohio Volunteer Infantry. When the explosion of the Sultana took place on the morning of the 27th of April, 1865, on the Mississippi River, I was on the hurricane deck, attending to a sick comrade, and, at his request, had just lain down with him only a few minutes when the explosion occurred. I was slightly scalded but remained on deck until the flames became so hot that I could remain no longer. I then jumped from the wheelhouse into the water, a distance of perhaps 35 feet. I struck on my feet and at once began swimming. After going a distance of about 3 miles, I caught hold of a piece of weather-beaten board about 6 feet long, which proved to be a great help to me. I continued swimming and floating with the current until I was 7 miles below the wreck, when I was picked up, more dead than alive, by a yawl from the gunboat Essex, and have never seen one well hour since. As soon as I was able to travel I left Memphis and went on board a steamer for Cairo, Illinois, remaining there one night, and took the train for Mattoon, Illinois, where we were met at the depot by the citizens with hot coffee and a bountiful supper. I then proceeded to Indianapolis, from there to Camp Chase, Ohio, reported to Colonel Richardson, and was discharged from the service. End of section 111. Section 112 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 112. A Shoemaker. I was born in Canal, Winchester, Ohio, March 3, 1845, and enlisted in the service of the United States at Elmore, Ohio, November 29, 1861, in Company E, 72nd Regiment Ohio Volunteer Infantry, and was captured at Guntown, Mississippi, June 10, 1864, and confined in Andersonville, Savannah, and Lawton prisons. I do not think it worth while to give my Sultana experience. My post office address is Carroll, Ohio. End of section 112. Section 113 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 113. W. T. Shumard. I was born in Clermont County, Ohio, July 25, 1835, and enlisted in the service of the United States at Camp Clay, Ohio, September 11, 1862, in Company A, 7th Regiment Ohio Volunteer Cavalry, and was captured between Nashville and Columbia, Tennessee, November 27, 1864, and confined in the Meridian, Mississippi, and Cahaba, Alabama prisons. After being a prisoner 5 months, on the 23rd of April, 1865, I, with about 2,000 prisoners of war, was driven like so many sheep on board the Sultana at Vicksburg. We went to Memphis and stopped and unloaded some freight, then to the coal docks and took on some coal. We then proceeded up the river about 8 miles, when her boilers exploded. This was about the 27th of April, 1865, about 2:00 a.m. I and 12 comrades lay side by side, asleep, just in front of the boilers on the lower deck. The first that I knew I was holding to a chain at the bow of the boat, had a bump on the back of my head, was badly scalded on the side of my head and face, and my feet also. I tried to climb up several times on the boat, not knowing what had happened. At length a man caught and pulled me up, then I saw what had happened. Of the 12 men who laid beside me, there was but one saved beside myself. This was John Bell of the same company and regiment. I stayed on the boat until 8 a.m., as I could not swim, then with 13 comrades left the boat on a small raft and was taken back to Memphis, and soon after went to Camp Chase, Ohio, my native state. On Saturday, the 20th of May, was discharged and went home. Occupation, farming. Post office address, Brazilton, Kansas. End of section 113. Section 114 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 114. J. L. Slick. I was born in Monroe County, Michigan, 1844, and enlisted in the service of the United States at Detroit, February 22, 1864, in Company A, 18th Regiment Michigan Infantry, and was captured at Athens, September 24, 1864, and confined in the Cahaba, Alabama prison. When the explosion occurred, I was thrown against the wheelhouse and knocked insensible. When I came to, I helped a comrade on a board 6 inches wide and 4 feet long, and as he was no swimmer, I took charge of the craft. We landed on a log at 7:00 a.m., and while there I drew a comrade out of the water who had his leg scalded so badly that the flesh dropped off. Occupation, merchant. Post office address, Lambertsville, Michigan. End of section 114. Section 115 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 115. Commodore Smith. I was born in Holmes Township, Crawford County, State of Ohio, on the 18th day of January, 1842. Removed with my father's family to Hillsdale County, State of Michigan, in the fall of 1854. My great-great-grandfather and my grandfather were soldiers in their day, and my father, Isaac Smith, and his 3 sons and son-in-law participated in the late war for the Union of the States in America. Father was a member of Company C of the 1st Michigan Volunteer Infantry. He was born of Scotch and English parentage in the year A.D. 1809 in eastern Virginia, being at the time of his enlistment, in October 1861, 52 years of age. He received a wound in the head and was taken a prisoner of war on the 3rd day of the notorious 7 days' battle before Richmond, Virginia, under the command of General George B. McClellan. Was taken to Richmond and confined in that hell hole commonly called Libby Prison for a period of about 3 months. He was soon afterwards paroled and sent to Exchange Camp near Alexandria, Virginia, where after 8 days, from exposure, starvation, and disease contracted while a prisoner, he died. Peace be to his ashes, whilst his blood crieth aloud for vengeance and just retribution against the rebel hordes that caused his suffering and death. My eldest brother, Columbus Smith, was a member of Company I, 18th Regiment Michigan Volunteer Infantry, and enlisted August 11, 1862, and died at Lexington, Kentucky, of typhoid pneumonia, December 28, 1862. My youngest brother, James Henry Smith, was a member of Company K, 27th Regiment Michigan Volunteer Infantry. He served to the close of the war and was discharged with his regiment. He died at Cambria, Hillsdale County, Michigan, from the effects of la grippe, December 31, 1891. My eldest sister's husband, Andrew A. Ewing, was a member of Company 2nd Regiment Michigan Volunteer Infantry. He served to the close of the war and was discharged with his regiment, and is still living at this date, April 10, 1892, in Hillsdale County, State of Michigan, and long may he live to enjoy reunions with his old comrades. I, myself, was a member of Company F, 18th Michigan Volunteer Infantry. I enlisted August 11, 1862, at Hillsdale, Hillsdale County, State of Michigan. Was captured September 24, 1864, by consolidated bands of guerrillas at Athens, Alabama, the notorious rebel General N. B. Forrest being in chief command. I was taken to Cahaba, Alabama, and there confined in prison for a period of nearly 6 months, and was reduced to a mere skeleton. My weight when captured was 175 pounds, and when I reached our lines at Vicksburg, Mississippi, March 16, 1865, my weight was 94 pounds, although I had not been sick a day while in prison. We remained at Vicksburg until April 25th or 26th, when we, to the number of 2,333 souls, all prisoners, were taken on board the ill-fated Sultana. At the time her boilers exploded, I was lying sound asleep on the lower deck, just back of the rear hatchway to the hold. I was not long in waking up, for I was nearly buried with dead and wounded comrades, legs, arms, heads, and all parts of human bodies and fragments of the wrecked upper decks. I struggled to my feet and tried to go forward on the boat, but could not on account of the wreckage and carnage of human freight which now covered the lower deck. The surface of the river for rods about the boat was covered with the same kind of wreckage. I remained on board the hull of the boat for perhaps 20 or 30 minutes, throwing overboard all the loose boards and timbers and everything that would float to assist those in the water and save them from drowning if possible. And now occurred the hardest task of my life. The boat was on fire and the wounded begged us to throw them overboard, choosing to drown instead of being roasted to death. While our hearts went out in sympathy for our suffering and dying comrades, we performed our sad but solemn duty. I say we because there were others besides myself who were fortunate enough not to be hurt or blown overboard by the explosion, and they too were doing all they could to alleviate the sufferings of their unfortunate comrades. We waited hoping, but in vain, to be rescued from the burning wreck. When at length the last shadow of hope had expired and we were forced to leave the burning boat and try our luck in the seething, foaming, cold and turbulent waters of the mighty Mississippi, and this too at about 2:00 in the morning and almost total darkness prevailing except the light from the burning wreck, we proceeded to perform carefully but hurriedly the most heart-rending task that human beings could be called upon to perform, that of throwing overboard into the jaws of certain death by drowning those comrades who were unable on account of broken bones and limbs to help themselves. Some were so badly scalded by the hot water and steam from the exploded boiler that the flesh was falling from their bones. Those comrades who were doubly endeared to us through mutual suffering and starvation while we were penned up in the rebel hell holes, or so-called Confederate prisons, and who instead of throwing them thus overboard, we were wanting to render every kindness to dress their wounds and soothe their sufferings. But, alas, this was impossible. The only alternative was to toss them overboard. Reader of this narrative, do you not think that this was a hard task for us to perform? If not, just hearken to this a moment. Listen to the heartfelt prayers of those suffering and wounded comrades and hear their dying requests as they commended their wives, children, fathers, mothers, sisters, and brothers to God's kind care and keeping, and hear them thanking us for our kindness to them, notwithstanding the pain they were suffering. They fully realized the fact that their last day, hour, and even last minute to live had come. And then to hear the gurgling sounds, the dying groans, and see them writhing in the water, and finally see them sink to rise no more until the morning when all shall come forth. Was this not heartrending to us? My heart even now, after 27 years, nearly stands still while I write this sad story. After we had thus cared for the helpless ones, I leaped over the burning wreck into the mighty waters and headed for Memphis, Tennessee, which from this point was about 7 miles down the river. I was a good swimmer, and after encountering several whirlpools and being carried around and around in them, each time being carried back into the center of the river, by hard struggling, keeping a cool head, and using my dexterity as a swimmer, I finally reached a point half a mile above the city of Memphis, where I lodged in a tree out in the flats of the river. The water at this point was about 20 feet deep. I remained in the tree until a boat came just at dawn and picked me up together with 27 others. Was afterwards taken to the city, where the Christian Commission cared for us until we were able to resume our journey homeward to God's country, as we called it, there to meet our loved ones from whom we had long been parted, and once more to enjoy the blessings of a free and united country, which we had so dearly bought, the price being blood. Occupation, hardware merchant. Post office address, Remus, Michigan. End of section 115. Section 116 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 116. Truman Smith. I was born in New Castle, Pennsylvania, February 6, 1848, and enlisted in the service of the United States at Gun Plains, Allegan County, Michigan, August 4, 1864, in Company B, 8th Regiment Michigan Cavalry. On the 24th of November we met the enemy near Henryville, Tennessee. There was but a handful of us against the army of Hood and Forrest. As the firing grew sharp, orders came for us to mount and retreat to the barricade, but my horse was gone. I made my escape into the woods with the rebel cavalry in close pursuit. Fortune favored me. There was a small marsh just ahead, and I went through the mire and came out on the opposite side. The rebel cavalry tried to follow me, but the horses mired. I thought I would try and find my regiment. I stayed at the house of a Union man all night and then started next morning for Columbia, Tennessee. On my way I came across a wagon train which I supposed was our own, but it proved to be a rebel train. I rode 2 miles and under the pretense of joining a rebel army that was passing, got off. I then went to the house of a Union man who gave me a blanket and some provisions and conducted me to a cave, saying it would not be safe for me to stay at the house as there were so many rebels around. I remained there 2 days and then started for the woods, but was met not 10 feet away by some rebels. Of course I had to surrender. They took my arms and robbed me of everything. Then I was taken to their camp. The night was very dark and I slipped past the guard and made my escape, but was soon captured again by a squad of rebel cavalry. They hurried us on until we reached Columbia, where they put us in Fort Misner. There were about 1,700 Union prisoners there. The rebels were on one side of Duck River and the Union forces on the other. We remained here several days until Hood was defeated at Nashville. Our rations consisted of corn on the cob from once to twice a day. We left in December for the Tennessee River. The ground was covered with ice and some of the boys had no shoes on. You could track them by the blood from their feet. We forded streams and camps where night overtook us. We crossed the Tennessee River and here about 400 escaped. The rebels pricked us with bayonets and drove us like cattle to Corinth, where we stayed a day or 2 and then started for Meridian, arriving there on the 25th of December. There were 2 stockades, one for Union prisoners and one for rebel deserters. A squad of us were put in the latter place. A day or 2 later we started for Cahaba, reaching there about the 1st of January. We were put in prison with about 3,000 others. Our rations here consisted of about a pint of meal, ground cob and all, and that moldy. Once in 10 days we would receive about 2 ounces of meat to the man. This we cut up in bits and made porridge with our meal. There was one attempt made to liberate the prisoners worthy of note. The author of the scheme was Captain Hanchett. His idea was to overpower the guards, take their guns and fight our way out. About 1:00 a.m., when everything was still and the guards had made their rounds, we heard a cry for help. They had succeeded in capturing the interior guard, but as they made for the door the bar was dropped in place and we were securely trapped. A long struggle ensued before the guards found out the leader of the revolt. They furnished neither rations nor allowed us to build a fire until our leader should be produced. For 3 days we had nothing to eat and no fire, and then Captain Hanchett gave himself up, saying it was better that he should die than should hundreds, who would surely perish in their famished condition. They took him out, tried him by court-martial, and sentenced him to be shot. He never gave away those who were associated with him in the plot to liberate the prisoners. We remained at Meridian until March. One day an order came for 300 men to load a boat with wood. We went down the Alabama River about 7 miles when the boat went ashore and we were taken off to load wood. We carried steadily until we had some 200 cords aboard. This occupied the whole day and we then started back to Cahaba. We were permitted to stay on the boat that night. In the morning we were taken to Selma and put in the stockade, we remaining there but a few days, when the other prisoners from Cahaba were sent there. We crossed the river the same night and then took the train for Meridian, Mississippi, arriving there just at dark and found ourselves back in the old stockade once more. The following morning we took the train for Jackson, reaching there about night. Now we were nearing our lines and learned that our troops were near the Black River, less than 40 miles. We were several days making the march. What a glorious sight met our eyes when we got there! On the opposite side floated the Stars and Stripes. Orders were to go into camp for the night, but I stole away and swam across the river and was once more under the old flag. Everything was excitement here. News came of the fall of Richmond and the surrender of Lee. Everybody was wild with joy and the thought of a speedy return to our homes. Salutes were fired from all the forts. Our joy, however, was of short duration, for on the 14th of April, as we got up in the morning, we found the colors at half-mast. It was some time before we knew the cause, and then we learned that President Lincoln had been assassinated. All thought of home was banished for the time being, and every man swore revenge. Everything was gloomy till about the 24th of April, when word came to get ready to go home. Everybody was ready. It was a short march to Vicksburg, where, lashed to the wharf, was the ill-fated steamer Sultana, on which a still greater horror was in store for the boys. We numbered about 2,200 from Castle Morgan and Andersonville, the greater part from Castle Morgan. When we boarded the Sultana, every foot of her deck was covered with men who had fought starvation, vermin, and filth. Memphis was reached without accident, and we got off the boat and went to the Soldiers' Rest, where I got something to eat. It was about midnight when the boat again got started up the river, and just after everybody had got settled down to sleep, except those in charge of the boat, there was a crash and all at once confusion. Someone cried out that the rebels had fired on to us. I thought a shell had exploded near me, but found it was hot steam. I jumped up, threw off the blankets, and found that the boat was wrecked. The boilers had exploded and the boat was on fire. I started around to see what the chances were for getting ashore. The fire was burning fast and furious, and men who were buried beneath the wreck were crying for help. When the fire lit up the water, men could be seen in every direction and also pieces of the wreck. The first one of our company that I met after the explosion was Henry Norton. He had lost a bundle of clothes and swore that he would shoot the man who stole them. I told him he had better let the clothes go and make up his mind to swim ashore. He said not until he found his clothes. He was an excellent swimmer and thought he could swim ashore in a few minutes. I left him there and went to look around. I saw that the pilot house was gone and that one stack lay across the deck. The fire was making great headway and men were begging, for God's sake, to have some one help them. It was getting so hot that I concluded to leave the boat. I looked around for something to hold me up in the water, but could find nothing as we were on the hurricane deck and had slept on the wheelhouse. The only thing that I could see was an empty pork barrel, and thinking perhaps that would hold me, threw it into the water and jumped in after it. At this time I had all my clothes on. My barrel was worthless and sank. I started to swim, but found that someone had hold of me and I could not get loose. We had a struggle in the water and I freed myself by giving him my blouse. The night was dark and I could not see which way to go. I swam but a few feet when I found myself with 4 or 5 others. It seemed as though we all wanted to get hold of each other. I succeeded in getting the rest of my clothes off and got rid of my company. It was only a few minutes before someone had hold of me again. This time I came near drowning. I kept getting away from the boat, and about an hour after it blew up I heard someone calling for help. I had a piece of 4-foot wood that would keep me up nicely. I swam towards the comrade and found it was Henry Norton. I gave him the piece of wood and swam away. He must have been chilled through, for he was found clinging to the piece of wood. I swam on trying to make shore. There was a large tree floating down the river, and on the roots were 3 or 4 men. They were singing the Star-Spangled Banner. As I swam away I heard someone coughing and swam toward him. As I came near he kept swimming away. I called him and asked what regiment he belonged to. He asked what I wanted to know for. I told him I would write to his people in case he drowned, and I should get out. He said I must not come any closer, and we made a bargain that if one should die and the other get ashore, the survivor should write the parents and let them know. We kept swimming till near daylight, when some one cried, "Halt!" We swam toward shore, and as we came closer the command to halt was repeated. I replied that we could not, as we were in the water. Finally we got to shore and we were told to get out, but my limbs were so benumbed that I could not. The man came to the water's edge, took me by the arm and pulled me ashore, but I could not stand on my feet. He called his comrade who was in the tent, and they together picked me up and put me in their bed, and then went back and rescued my comrade. They built a fire and rubbed us and gave us some clothes. After a while we saw a boat coming up the river and we hailed it. It had started to pick up the survivors of the wreck. I was the first and my comrade next. The first thing after we got on the boat they brought me a tin cup of whiskey which I drank. I had got so that I could walk by this time. We kept going up the river, picking up men and making them comfortable as possible. We picked up about 100 and started for Memphis, reaching there about 8 o'clock. The dock was covered with ladies belonging to the Christian and Sanitary Commissions, who gave us each a pair of drawers and a shirt. I started uptown, but at the first block I came to there was a great crowd and they wanted to know if I was on the boat. I said yes, and they gave me a suit of clothes and $13 in money. From there I went to the Soldiers' Rest, and was afterward sent to the hospital. I called for paper and wrote a letter home, giving a detailed account of the disaster. Then I became sick and was unconscious. What became of the clothes and money I never knew. I was taken care of by Comrade White. My journey to Columbus must have been a tedious one. Here we met several of our regiment, and among them was Charles Seabury, he having his hands and face badly burned from the fire on the boat. We also met Ezra Spencer. Present occupation, Captain No. 5 steamer, Grand Rapids Fire Department. Post office address, No. 5 Engine House, Grand Rapids, Michigan. End of section 116. Section 117 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 117. Edward Sorgan. I was born in Switzerland in 1842 and enlisted in the service of the United States at Kenton, Ohio, April 16, 1861, in Company G, 4th Regiment Ohio Volunteer Infantry, and was captured at Gettysburg, July 2, 1863, and confined in the following prisons: Belle Isle, Andersonville, Millen, Savannah, and Blackshear Station. At the time of the explosion of the boiler of the Sultana, I was knocked overboard and swam and floated down the river to a little below Memphis, where I was picked up by 3 men in a skiff and put on board one of our gunboats. This was about break of day. In the morning I was sent to a hospital and remained there only a short time, when I was sent to Columbus, Ohio. Occupation, manufacturer and dealer in furniture. Post office address, Kenton, Ohio. End of section 117. Section 118 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 118. M. H. Sprinkle. I was born in Richland County, Ohio, September 15, 1841. Enlisted in the service of the United States at Ashland, Ohio, on the 15th of April, 1861, in Company B, 16th Regiment Ohio Volunteer Infantry. We were taken from the battlefield at Athens, Alabama, September 24, 1864, where 350 of us, under Lieutenant Colonel Elliott, held our own for 6 hours against 15,000 under Forrest. Our ammunition giving out, we were obliged to surrender, became prisoners of war, and taken to Cahaba Prison. To give a correct impression of one's sufferings would be impossible, except to those who have endured the hardships of such a place. I, like all the others, had to give up my watch, chain, and money, what I had not succeeded in hiding in my waistband. An officer came in and exchanged my new hat for his old one, and detecting that I had on 2 pairs of pants, pointed his revolver at me and demanded the new pair which I had been fortunate enough to secure only the day before. Our food consisted of a pint of corn chop once a day, providing the guard did not forget us, which he did sometimes. The longest time he forgot me was 4 days. We had nothing but the hard earth or boards on which to sleep. Thinking I could make a better place than this for my head, I cut off my pants legs and filled one with the siftings of my corn chop, giving the other one to a comrade for a like purpose. We stayed in this prison until the 1st of April, 1865. A call was then made for 800 men to form in line. I was one of the first to fall in, for I did not care where we were going. It seemed that nothing worse could be given us than what we were receiving, but our feelings can better be imagined than expressed when, after lying 2 weeks in parole camp at Vicksburg, we heard that a boat was waiting at the river for us. The report turned out to be true. The boat was the ill-fated steamer Sultana, and she was headed for Cairo. 18 of my company were upon the hurricane deck at the extreme stern of the boat. Of that number I know of but 4 that escaped the terrible accident of the morning of April 27th. On that morning about 2 o'clock one of the boilers exploded. The boat soon took fire, and Billy Lockhart and myself threw at least 50 of those who had been wounded in the explosion overboard, thinking it better that they should take their chances of drowning than be left to burn up, which they would do if left on the boat. Finally we were compelled to go, as the deck was about to fall in. I then noticed Charlie Ogden, of my company, who appeared to be standing in a dazed condition. I spoke to him, telling him he must go or he would burn, but he appeared to take no notice of what I said. I felt the deck tottering, and ran and sprang into the river. As I came to the surface, the deck had fallen in, and I have no doubt Charlie perished in the flames, as he had not made a move when I left him. I swam over to the west side of the river, but the banks were too steep for me, so the only alternative I had was to float down the stream, which I could easily do, or drown. I chose the former, but was nearly exhausted. On my way down the stream I came in contact with two men who were clinging to a trap door about 3 feet square. Neither of them could swim, and as I was floating so easily along they begged me to help them get out. I steadied their raft for them and pushed it along downstream. We were going along fairly well when a drowning man seized my left leg. I tried to kick him loose, but failing I let go the raft and tried to force him off, but could not, and was obliged to drag that dead weight until we reached Memphis. We were helped out of the water just above the wharf by citizens, and the last I can recollect was they were trying to pry the dead man's grip loose from my leg. The next I knew I was on the boat and having a very hard chill. The captain gave me some brandy, and I think I must have drank at least a pint before I began to feel the effects, then I began to sweat profusely. The citizens afterwards took me home with them and gave me a suit of clothes. I stayed with them about 9 days, finally starting up the river on the steamer Belle Memphis and reaching home on the 21st day of May, 1865. My present occupation is that of a mason. My post office address, Eaton Rapids, Michigan. End of section 118. Section 119 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 119. E. J. Squire. I was born in Norwalk, Ohio, January 8, 1839, and enlisted in the service of the United States at Monroeville, Ohio, August 9, 1862, in Company D, 101st Ohio Volunteer Infantry. I was captured near Huntsville, Alabama, January 17, 1865, and confined in the Selma and Cahaba, Alabama prisons. Occupation, dry goods and boot and shoe dealer. Monroeville, Huron County, Ohio. End of section 119. Section 120 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 120. Joseph Stevens. I was born in Yorkshire, England in 1842, and came to this country when a boy with my father, mother, and one sister. My brother Thomas was born in Hillsdale, and mother died when he was a baby. Soon after her death, father went back to England to attend to some business, and died there. I, but a mere lad, took care of myself, sister, and baby brother by doing anything I could get to do. June 20, 1861, when but 19 years old, I enlisted in Company E, Captain W. Lombard's company, at Hillsdale, Michigan, and was mustered into the 4th Michigan Infantry, in command of Colonel D. A. Woodbury at Adrian, Michigan. The regiment left its rendezvous for Washington June 25th, arrived during the night of July 2nd, and went into camp near Georgetown, where we joined the Army of the Potomac. We remained here in camp but a few days, and then were ordered to Bull Run, but were halted at Fairfax Court House, 9 miles this side, until further orders. A message came from Washington to be delivered to General McDowell, commanding the Union forces at Bull Run. I was detailed to deliver it, and was told to take the first horse I came across. I captured a fine bay stallion from a rebel planter living near by. I mounted him and delivered my message. When I arrived there I found the army retreating towards Washington, and we camped near there all winter. In the following spring we went with General McClellan's army down in front of Richmond. We were engaged in the battle of Yorktown, defeated the Rebs and then marched on towards Richmond. At New Bridge, 7 miles this side, our regiment was ordered to the front, where we met the Louisiana Tigers and killed and captured half their number with but a small loss on our side. In the 7 days' fight in front of Richmond I was captured and sent to Libby Prison. I was there but a short time when I was exchanged on account of sickness and was sent to Philadelphia Hospital, remaining there until I received my discharge, when I went home. I was home only 1 week, for as they were organizing a company in Hillsdale, I re-enlisted in the 1st Michigan Sharpshooters and encamped at Kalamazoo. I was made sergeant of Company B, and being a veteran was appointed drill master. Shortly after this we were mustered into the regiment under command of Colonel C. V. DeLand. We assisted in driving Morgan out of Ohio and Indiana, and then returned to Dearborn, Michigan, and proceeded under orders to Camp Douglas, Chicago, where we were placed on duty guarding a camp of rebel prisoners. We remained in Chicago nearly 6 months, and then were ordered to Annapolis, Maryland, to join the Army of the Potomac. We arrived there in due time and proceeded to Warrenton Junction. A few days later we marched across the Rapidan River, and the following 2 days were engaged in the Battle of the Wilderness, we sustaining a very small loss. Marching with the army to Spotsylvania Court House, we participated in a 3 days' fight, suffering very severely. From there we marched on to Cold Harbor, where we were engaged again, but being in the supporting line suffered but little. We arrived in front of Petersburg June 16, 1864, and on the following day happened one of the most prominent events in the history of this regiment. At night, while charging into the Rebs, I had a rooster tied to my belt that I had just captured, intending to have a feast for supper, but I was captured in that action, still holding on to the rooster, and it was eaten by the Johnnies. The 14th New York Heavy Artillery was on our extreme left, and when the rebels came rushing out of the woods, charging upon us with a terrible yell, the New York regiment, like a flock of sheep, ran and left us. This left our extreme left without any support, and the Rebs came upon us with a furious charge, but we met them with cold steel and had a fierce struggle until we were overpowered and obliged to surrender, leaving most of our regiment killed, wounded, and captured. I was then taken to Petersburg to the Provost Marshal's office to be searched. I had 2 $20 greenbacks hid on my person where they could not find them. There I was put in a tobacco house which was used as a temporary prison. The next day a squad of us were detailed to go after some rations. I was one of the first who volunteered to go, thinking I would have a chance to escape, but they had us guarded too strong. On our way a party of women that were standing before a mansion spit in our faces. I then said to the guard, "We wouldn't allow you men to be treated so in the North." He replied, "Keep still, you damn Yank, or I'll shoot you." They kept us here a few days under Grant's fire. One of the shells struck the roof of the tobacco house but injured no one. From here we were loaded into the box cars and sent to Andersonville prison. We were 8 days on the road, and on arriving my money was all gone. I had spent it for food. We were then taken to the stockade, in which were imprisoned at that time 30,000 Union men. Here I met a number of my old comrades who were in my company, 4th Michigan, captured the preceding year. My friends warned me of a gang of raiders, men who had become desperate. When new prisoners came, these men would rob the poor fellows and sometimes cut their throats. We formed a company to capture the leaders of this notorious gang. We captured 6 of them and turned them over to the rebels for safe keeping until we could send word to General Sherman to ask what we could do with them. His answer was, "Court-martial them and do what you think best." They were then court-martialed and sentenced to be hung, and the balance of the raiders to run the gauntlet. We had a scaffold erected inside the stockade, and then the rebels delivered them over to us. We stood them in a row, each with a rope around his neck. Our minister then offered a prayer for them, and when he finished the trap fell, but the rope broke and let one of them loose. He ran through the crowd, but was soon brought back, and seeing the rest hanging, pleaded for mercy, but the cry was, "String 'em up." He was put upon the scaffold the second time and hung there with the others until sundown, so everyone could have an opportunity of seeing them, as a warning for the rest of the gang. They were taken down and buried all in one grave. The food they gave us was corn cobs, all ground up and made into mush, and there wasn't near enough of that to keep the boys alive any length of time. Those that lived had to speculate by trading their brass buttons, boots, etc., with the guards. There were from 100 to 150 boys dying every day. A large wagon, drawn by 4 mules, was used in drawing out the dead. They were laid in as we pile cordwood and taken to the burying ground, generally putting 50 in a grave, and returning would bring mush in the same wagon, where worms that came from the dead could be seen crawling all over it. But we were starving, therefore we fought for it like hungry hogs. The squad that I was in was quartered on the north side of the creek which ran through the prison. The boys would dig wells in the daytime and at night would dig tunnels and attempt to escape. Very few, however, ever succeeded, for the Rebs would set the bloodhounds on the track. The hounds would tree them and wait for their masters to come to shoot the poor fellows down, but sometimes would bring them back unharmed. One day there was a call for a detail of men to go to the hospital to help take care of the sick. A friend, by the name of William Smith, was quartermaster of the hospital. He had been captured a year before and was a comrade of mine out of Company E, 4th Michigan. By the aid of friend Smith I was put on the detail list and was made wardmaster of one of the wards. The first day I was in there, the rebel doctors left prescriptions to give the sick. I killed 7 boys that evening from the effects of that medicine. I told Smith I couldn't do that work any longer, and the next day I played off sick, so as to get off duty, and the doctors left me medicine to take, but I wasn't prepared to die and so did not take any. I then commenced to make a kind of beer which is good for dysentery. It was made of corn meal, molasses, and water. I would let it ferment and sour overnight in a barrel and then deal it out to the boys, a cupful only to each. This was much better than the rebels' medicine. It was the means of saving the lives of a good many boys. I would trade this beer off for brass buttons and postage stamps, and then would take these and trade with the guards for sweet potatoes. For doing this I was taken before Wirz, the captain in command of the prison, and a villain who would shoot our men down in cold blood. I expected to be dealt with the same, but fortunately some of my friends, Union men, were clerking for him, and when he was about to shoot me, after taking an oath, with his revolver, the boys talked to him and begged him not to. I was then searched and ordered back to the hog pen, where I remained for 10 long months. About the middle of April, 1865, there came an order for an exchange of prisoners. Although my name was not called for exchange, I stole away, secreted myself in a box car, and was carried through to Vicksburg, Miss., with the others. I think where our exchange took place was at Black River Bridge near Vicksburg. We then crossed the pontoon bridge into our lines and proceeded to get clothing and recruit up. We remained there about 10 days. I met my brother-in-law, William Finch, here. He had just been exchanged from Cahaba prison in Alabama. On April 25, 1865, about 2,000 of us, just released from rebel prisons, were put aboard the ill-fated steamer Sultana and started for home. We stopped at Memphis, Tennessee, to take in coal and unload 300 hogsheads of sugar. While there I and my brother-in-law took a walk uptown to get something good to eat, which we had not tasted for many a long day. When we returned, we took our blankets and lay down on the hurricane deck next to the wheelhouse to sleep and dream of our dear ones at home, and believing that in a few more hours we would be in their embrace. I at once fell asleep and did not awake until the boiler blew up, 6 or 7 miles above Memphis. The boat was soon in flames, and the screaming and moaning from those that were injured was something terrible. Hundreds of them would jump into the water together, clinch each other, and go down in one body. My brother-in-law commenced fretting and crying because he couldn't swim. I could not swim either, and begged him not to get discouraged and give up, for there was some hope yet of being saved. He started for one of the lifeboats, and I warned him to keep away from them, for those in first were knocking everybody on the head that tried to get in. That was probably where he lost his life. I remained on the boat, praying until the fire burned me off. On falling into the river I sank, never expecting to rise again, but by some means I came to the surface again and saw the captain tearing off window shutters and throwing them into the river for the boys. I now commenced swimming dog fashion, but my strength soon gave out and I began to strangle. I yelled for help, and Comrade Charles Tabor, one whose life I had saved while in prison, heard and knew my voice, and swam away from the bale of hay on which he was floating, caught me by the hair, and with the aid of other men who were on the bale, pulled me on top, and thus in turn saving my life. I was chilled and lost consciousness, and when I came to I asked if it had been raining, for I was wet through. We hung on to the bale and floated down 6 or 8 miles below Memphis, where we were picked up by a gunboat that was out for the purpose of rescuing survivors of the wreck. The Sisters of Charity were there ready to take care of us. We were then taken to the hospital in Memphis, where I remained about 2 weeks. I can well remember seeing the captain putting life preservers on his wife and little girl and letting them overboard. The girl's life preserver slipped too far down, for she was found, drowned, floating with her feet upwards. His wife was saved, and the captain lost his life in trying to save others. We had a number of mules aboard the boat, and some of the boys hung on to their tails while they swam to shore. Others would get out by means of planks and barrels. This was one of the most terrible steamboat disasters that history has ever recorded, over 1,500 perishing. I was taken to Camp Chase, Ohio, where I received my discharge, and then started for Hillsdale to meet my brother and sister. I have left a great deal out which I would like to have mentioned, but thinking I am taking more space than is my share in your book, I will close. Am now living in East Buffalo, New York, in livestock commission business, under the firm name of Dunning and Stevens. End of section 120. Section 121 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 121. George W. Stewart. I enlisted in the service of the United States on the 6th of January, 1862, as a private in Company D of the 40th Regiment Indiana Veterans Volunteers. Was on duty in the Army of the Cumberland until the Battle of Franklin, Tennessee, which took place on the 30th day of November, 1864, where I was taken prisoner. I was captured at the time of the charge of the rebels under General Pat Cleburne and sent to the rear as a prisoner of war. I had $200 and a silver watch worth $50 taken from me. From the battlefield I was taken to Columbus, Tennessee, and kept there until the last of December, then marched to Corinth, Mississippi, from there by rail to Meridian, thence to Selma, Alabama, and finally to prison at Cahaba, Alabama. In this prison there were about 2,500 prisoners, and we were all on short rations, the customary treatment of prisoners by the Confederate States. I cannot tell the date when I left the prison, but I think it was the last of February, 1865. I was with the 1st Detachment that went to Vicksburg, Mississippi, and a hard time we had of it. We did a great deal of forced marching to get there. I never can forgive the quartermaster for not giving us rations on the night we arrived at Black River. He held the rations on one side of the river and us on the other side. 14 hours, without anything to eat. We lay in camp until we were placed on board the Sultana. I had a jolly trip to Memphis. Being the son of a steamboat captain, I was at home on the river. At Memphis I was in town till midnight, and was awake when the boat was at the coal yards. At the time of the explosion I was sound asleep on the larboard wheelhouse water box on the hurricane deck. When I awoke I was standing about 10 feet from the box in a thick steam. While there my comrade, George A. Kent, came to me from the roof of the Texas and asked me what was up. I told him that the boat had blown up, and if she did not catch on fire we were all right. Just at that moment the fire burst out where the chimneys had stood. I then told him we would have to swim or burn. I urged him to go with me to the Texas to see if we could obtain anything to swim upon. We started together, and that is the last I saw of him. I got 2 bed slats and went aft of the wheelhouse on the hurricane deck and witnessed the drowning of hundreds of men. I saw the stage plank go overboard loaded with men and go under with them. When it arose there were only 2 or 3 clinging to it. I kept my post aft of the wheelhouse until the fire forced me to jump. I at once swam away from the boat and would not let anyone come near me. By the light of the burning wreck I could see timber on the south or east bank, up the stream from me, and I believed that I held my own against the current for over 1 hour, when I discovered the boat was drifting and I was not going to the timber. I then changed my route and went with the current, and landed on an island 3 miles above Memphis, just at daylight, and fought mosquitoes until 10:30 o'clock, when I was taken on board a steamer to Memphis. The next day I went down to the river and met Captain Carmer, and with him to New Albany, thence to see my parents in Kentucky. Was discharged on the 29th of May, 1865, at Indianapolis. Occupation, farming. Postoffice address, Wellington, Kansas. End of section 121. Section 122 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 122. Samuel Stubberfield. I was born in McCain County, Pennsylvania, September 9, 1843. When I was about 2 years of age, my parents moved to Ottawa County, Ohio, from there to Williams County, Ohio, and in 1854 I, with my parents, moved to Wright Township in Hillsdale County, Michigan, where I lived at the breaking out of the rebellion. I enlisted in the service of the United States on the 26th of July, 1862, in Company F, 18th Michigan Infantry, for 3 years or during the war, unless sooner discharged. I left the state September 4th for Cincinnati, Ohio, where we took up our line of march through Kentucky. Reaching Lexington, I spent most of the winter in the hospital and convalescent camp, and about the 1st of April, 1863, left the state with my regiment for Nashville, Tennessee, where I remained about 14 months. I then left for Decatur, Alabama, and was one of the detail that routed the rebels at Pond Spring on the 29th of June, 1864, capturing 9 wagons and 2 ambulances that the rebels had taken from an Indiana regiment some time before this, and also one of their wagons and 2 of their ambulances. Was also one of the detail that helped to rout the rebels at Courtland, Alabama, on the 27th of July, 1864, losing only 1 man from my company. On the 24th of September, I was in the detachment ordered to reinforce the fort at Athens, Alabama. When we got within a mile of the place we were attacked by an overwhelming force of rebels at about 6 o'clock in the morning, and we had to fight our way until 12 o'clock. As we neared the fort that we were to reinforce we received grape, canister, and shell from the fort, its commander having surrendered it, and our little band with it without our knowledge. But our small force, 400, fought the rebel General Forrest's force 6 long hours before surrendering, when we were completely surrounded and were finally compelled to give in. We afterwards took up our line of march for that miserable prison, Cahaba, Alabama, at which place we arrived October 6, 1864, and remained there until the 4th of March, 1865. When I left the prison the water was from 6 inches to 4 1/2 feet deep all over the entire enclosure, had been so for 7 days, and had been 6 inches deeper. I slept 2 nights on a 16-inch wall, which was 15 feet above the water, and some of the boys did their cooking among the braces of the roof. On the date before stated, March 4th, I got aboard a steamer and steamed down the Alabama River, up the Tombigbee River as far as navigable, and then by rail to Meridian. From thence we were sent to Jackson, Mississippi, and from there we marched to Vicksburg, where we went into parole camp March 16, 1865. On the 25th of April, 1865, was placed on board the steamer Sultana, which was to carry us homeward to friends and loved ones. But alas, hundreds passed on to the city of death to await mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, and lovers whom they had expected to meet in a few days, but were destined to pass over the river whence no parting ever comes. We reached Memphis on the 26th of April, and while unloading sugar there, the staging parted, one half turning over catching my right foot and leg to the knee and bruising my foot badly. It soon swelled as full as the skin could hold and pained me badly. When the explosion took place at 2 o'clock a.m., April 27th, I could not bear any weight on my foot, but was compelled to leave the boat, being forced off by the flames. I picked up a 4x4 scantling, which someone had discarded, and went to the rear part of the boat, jumped off into the river, and sank for a moment in that chilling ice-cold water. On coming to the surface again I struck out in the same direction that most of the others did, but thinking I had not acted wisely, I turned around to go in the opposite direction when someone caught hold of my frail bark. Not feeling like parting company with my little craft so soon, I clutched it with all my might and eventually succeeded in releasing it. I then struck out in the direction of some trees, reaching the little cottonwoods just at daylight. The little trees were so frail, however, and the water so deep, that my little craft, with what trees I could get hold of, would not keep me out of the water, and I was compelled to remain here until about 11 o'clock in the morning of April 27th, when I was picked up by the steamer Silver Spray and taken to the hospital at Memphis, Tenn. I remained in the hospital until about the middle of May, when I was sent to the Soldiers' Home, where I was discharged the service, and reached my home on the 19th of May, 1865. My occupation is farming. End of section 122.